So welcome to the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. It's a huge honor to be welcoming you all. And we're going to be talking very soon about a really interesting document that we've written with Camden Council. We have some of the members here who I still don't understand who's allowed to talk and who's not now that we're under an election, and the Future Governance Forum, about how do we actually build 21st century governments that do more than just level the playing field. What does it mean to tilt the playing field in a direction to build economies that are inclusive, sustainable, participatory with business, with government, with civil society? And we'll talk more about the report in a second. I just want to say that this is really why I set up the Institute 6 years ago here at University College London. Thrilled that our provost is here, Michael Spence. Because what we actually need is not just better policies or better bureaucracies that we'll talk about today. We actually need a new type of thinking, that kind of new economics thinking that's required. We have a PhD program. We have postdoc fellows here pushing the economics agenda. We also need new practice. So we work a lot with policymakers globally. And we try to bring those lessons back to the theory, but especially the training. And I see lots of faces here of our students, our master's students, and our PhD students. What we've tried to do is to actually rewrite the curriculum. So the mindset that we need so that when ministers come and go, governments come and go, what does it mean to actually land some of the ideas that we'll be talking about today, literally in the everyday training? What does market shaping look like if it's not just fixing market failures? What's public purpose? What's public value? The BBC talks about it, but what is it? How do we measure it? How do we scale it? Anyway, I will now stop. After welcoming you to our very hot building. I'm sure this is illegal. We can't open the windows because then all sorts of furniture would fall down. But Kamal, we are so grateful that you have agreed to host this, especially given that this is your second week in your new job.
It is. Thank you so much, Mariana. It's good that there is no aircon here, so we're helping the net zero journey, which is wonderful. It's a really exciting moment, isn't it? Of course, we're in an election campaign. I've just come from recording the latest edition of the Daily Tea, which is our daily Telegraph news podcast about left and right and the centre and how do you actually win an election. I don't quite hear in the streets of London or the streets of Birmingham or the streets of Glasgow demonstrators walking the streets saying, what do we want? Mission-led government. When do we want it? Now. But in this amazing report, which we are going to talk about over the next hour and a half or so, there is an idea behind it which is about public participation beyond government and beyond politicians themselves in partnership, which actually can be a very invigorating idea. We also know I've had a long career in journalism. I have worked for The Guardian, I've worked for The Observer, I've been head of news for The Observer I was political editor at The Observer and the head of news The Observer through the Blair government. I've been business and economics editor at the BBC. I've started my own company. I now work for The Telegraph. I have seen many ideas come and go since I started working in the early 1990s. There are three big chunks of history. I'm a politics and economics student of Leeds University. 45 to 79, the Keynesian consensus, business, government, and workforces in the form of unions working together. 1979, that was broken apart by the Chicago School, the idea of markets in charge, Thatcherite Reagan consensus. Built on slightly with social justice with Blair, but then crashed and burnt in 2007 and 2008 and the financial crisis. I don't think anything has come since then to replace the idea of how government works for the good of the people. Productivity has been in the doldrums since that time, and government policy is now afflicted by many global institutions in a multipolar world, net zero, climate change, artificial intelligence, big tech monopsony. How do we really build societies and policies that work? And mission-led has some inklings of how government in partnership with business, third sector, the public can think about how policies can change. So next to Mariana is Nathan Yuell. He is the executive director and founder of the Future Governance Forum. Welcome, Nathan. And Helen McNamara, who was the Deputy Cabinet Secretary and head of the Cabinet Secretariat, responsible for the operation of Cabinet government. We were due to be joined by Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council, who just yesterday was confirmed as the candidate for Maida Vale and Queen's Park, and now as a Labour candidate is going to be tramping the streets of NW, whatever that is, knocking doors to see if they can be successful in their progress towards July the 4th. I am here as a neutral observer and chair, just to be clear to absolutely everyone. So I will be asking the questions rather than giving opinions of my own. But Mariana, kick us off with the report itself. Then we will come to Nathan and to Helen, and then we'll have a discussion here. And then we'll come to you wonderful people here in real life. And hello to everyone who is live streaming in. We hope you enjoyed as much as we do, and we hope it's slightly cooler wherever you are. Mariana, tell us all about the report itself.
Great. And why don't we divide our role a bit about, I can talk about why we were a partner in writing this report and where even the whole concept, if you want, of missions comes from, especially because it seems like everyone now is jumping on the missions bandwagon, and we should be careful that it doesn't just become a term where it's, old wine and new bottles or whatever the expression is. It should actually be a catalytic concept that reignites a country, especially one that has so many problems. So the reason, again, that I set up IPP is that, as long as we just think that governments are fixing markets, then we, by definition, will be too little too late. We'll be reactive, not proactive, and also a bit negative, right? You're kind of waiting for something to fail or worrying that it might fail. So I often joke that I walk in to rooms as an economist and I come out as a life coach, because you kind of got to cheer people up again about what does collective value creation mean. So what we've been doing globally, but we work very closely with Camden Council, Georgia Gould, again, the leader. We have Nick Kimber here. We have Dan Wainwright, who now is working with Camden. He was one of our students, master's public administration students, working with Camden at a very local level on this concept. So what does the concept mean? It's not just a mission statement. We're going to be competitive. We're going to grow. We're going to have jobs and do great things. It's actually, for us at least, what we've been trying to do as an institution, again, the new economic thinking behind it, is how can you have a catalytic policy that makes things happen that otherwise would not have, but with a direction, right? Growth has not just a rate, it has a direction. This country has been growing, at least in the past, but growing through a specific way. Remember, GDP has those four components, G plus I plus C plus X minus M. It's been growing through consumption, not investment. Consumption that has been fueled by private debt. I'm talking about the United Kingdom. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income in this country is at an extremely high level, close to what it was at the beginning of the financial crisis. So definancializing an economy, transforming it to have investment-led growth in an environment where business continues to have actually low investment. We are in low investment economy. People obsess about public investment. We'll talk about public investment today. But we have lower than average business investment. We can talk about Brexit, but to be honest, all we need to say is Brexit made that worse, right? Because when business invests when it sees a market or a technological opportunity, what did Brexit do? It reduced the market size. So missions are about saying, okay, if growth has not just a rate, but a direction, and if, it's not obvious, if we care about that direction, what does it mean to actually set some goals, right? So there's challenges, but real goals that have a direction. You can actually say yes or no, did we achieve it? And to do exactly what Kamal said, which is to catalyze public and private sector investment, but also other types of investment. It's not just public and private in that direction. So we talk about the moon landing. Why? Because the challenge was the space race. The direction was to the moon and back in a short amount of time. But what it actually did was then catalyze lots of investment across sectors as different as aerospace, nutrition, materials, electronics. And because government, NASA, took care to change, this is a critical bit, change its instruments. They changed procurement from being just cost plus to fixed price with incentives for quality improvement. They were able to crowd in bottom-up experimentation, not micromanaging it top-down, bottom-up experimentation to solve all those homework problems along the way. What would the astronauts wear? What would they eat? How would they move? That's what got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, so on and so forth. The reason I'm belaboring this a bit is it's critical. A challenge, hunger, poverty, gender parity, the SDGs, right? Every country has actually signed up to those. Transforming them into moonshots, which mean they're inspirational, they're directed, you can answer yes or no, that are cross-sectoral, right? You don't want your missions to be captured by the life sciences sector, the renewable sector, AI, cross-sectoral collaboration and interaction to achieve the goal. But the critical bit in terms of the statecraft that we're going to be talking about today is what does it mean for the changes you need to make to the status quo of how you do procurement, how you do loans, how you do grants and subsidies, not just handouts of money, but catalytic policies that get those homework problems along the way solved, or at least attempting to solve them. We have to, allow experimentation, failure, and so on. So the work we've done globally, and then we worked with Camden Council, is what does that literally mean for procurement? What does it mean for a wealth fund? So with Camden, we've just helped set up a new public wealth fund, a new type of procurement, outcomes-oriented procurement. Dan led this work around adult social care. What does it mean to actually not just have outcomes orientation, but participation? So the carees and the carers helping to design that outcomes orientation. We had Jennifer Patka here, who's just written a great book on the US digital economy, saying most services, digital services, are designed by people who've never accessed those services, like welfare. Anyway, so those issues of not only the policy design, but the institutional redesign, the tool redesign, whether it's a public bank or procurement, but also that participatory side, which is so important, especially in local contexts and cities and councils, is something we've just been learning a lot from. And we were thrilled when FGF, Future Governance Forum, approached us to say, why don't we partner up and ask, what does it mean for this country, especially, well, again, I have to remember not to talk about the election, especially what? Especially nothing, for rethinking the bureaucracy of government, any government, whether it's conservatives, whether it's labor. Again, these are lessons that are global about the bureaucracy. What is a dynamic, creative, agile, flexible bureaucracy? What does it mean to design dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic public-private partnerships, especially in a country where we had problematic PPPs, right? There wasn't a very clear goal where we then crowded in the private sector and the health sector, but didn't actually achieve what we would call missions. So maybe you can talk a bit about then what you, Dan, Grace, Sarah Doyle, who's here as well, did in terms of actually these great interviews that you did inside the civil service, people that we've also worked with in the Institute, and some of the granular, interesting word, lessons that you learned around some of these themes, both on the bureaucratic side, the interministerial side, and the tool redesign.
Mission accepted. So, hello everyone. My name is Nathan Yowell. I'm the Executive Director, as both Kamal and Mariana have said, of the Future Governance Forum of FGF. Now, we only celebrated our 6-month anniversary last Monday, so I won't feel offended if you're scratching your heads about what we're doing. But essentially, we established last year, we were quite lucky to have like a developmental phase for much of last year. We've established ourselves as a non-partisan but avowedly progressive think tank that actually cares more about the how of better government, of better mechanisms, of better structures than necessarily coming out with another shopping list of what we think progressive parties should do in the UK. And we basically had this beautiful sort of scheme of programmes and outputs planned to the end of the year in all sorts of colours and proper titles and numberings, but Mr. Sunak sort of buggered that up slightly last week with the calling election. So like many others in this room, we're busily trying to work out what we're doing over the next couple of weeks. But I was very pleased that actually we could get this event out the door today before that formal pre-election period kicks off tomorrow. So as well as being the director of the Future Governance Forum, I am actually a Labour councillor in South Wales, in Torfaen County Borough Council, where I also chair the Greater Gwent Pension Fund. And it's been quite interesting actually doing this work, getting my head around some of those issues from a financial point of view and seeing where the jigsaw fits. I am just, for the benefit of the doubt though, well, there's no benefit for the doubt though, I am speaking as the director of FGF today, not as a party politician on this platform. Right, so basically, There's 5 or 6 things I want to say. The first thing I've got to do, though, is start with an apology, because I am not the leader of Camden, Georgia Gould. As Kamal says, and again, you've probably seen the news, George has been selected as the new Labour candidate for Queen's Park and Maida Vale. She does send her apologies. She's actually further westwards down Euston Road at the moment. She's had her first set of campaign photos done today, so she's busy knocking on doors in the new constituency. I'm sure that everyone here will join with me in wishing her luck over the next couple of weeks, regardless of political affiliation, because it's a big job she's taken on board. And I'd just like to say, sort of publicly, in best part of 25 years in working in and around Westminster, Whitehall, BBC, other organisations, she is one of the most brilliant politicians I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And as much as she might be Camden's loss and our loss at FGF, where she's a policy on our policy advisory group, she really is. It's a big gain for Westminster. She's going to do fantastic things, and I think she's a big advocate for many of the things in this report and for the causes that all of us in this room share. But she's not gone just yet. I've not come to bury her. I have come to praise her. George's drive, her imagination, and her inspiration run through this paper. She's on every page of this paper because actually it's her animating spirit of coming into Camden in 2017 and just doing things differently that has led us to be here. And like I said, as Mariana said, she's also the reason why the thing has been produced in the first place. So when George and I started talking about 18 months ago now about what we thought FGF could or should be, she was adamant that missions had to be one of the issues we looked at, and trying to work out that, from her point of view at least, if Keir was elected, how we could actually come forward with some kind of scheme that would enable Labour to implement a mission-driven approach to government. She was also adamant that we had to work with Mariana and the team at IIPP, building on George's personal and institutional relationships. And hence, the reason for this actual unique and bespoke partnership from both parts, actually. Between our organisations, we're bridging Whitehall, town halls, and Parliament with the work of the Academy. I think we're very lucky to be using the intellectual frameworks that Mariana has pioneered over the last decade to make the case for and then propose a new practice of mission-driven government. And in large part, that's because missions are not just a way of driving growth in the economy, as Mariana said. They're also a way of driving better public service outcomes through a new form of statecraft, allowing the state to make choices about where and how it wants to see growth directed. So that's basically the context for where we are. And I am looking down because I'm not one of the report authors. This has been sort of sprung on me quite sharpishly by Georgia. Love her as I do. So essentially, I've got 5 very quick reflections on the span of the work and some of the main things we're arguing. Irritatingly, there are 6 principles in the paper, and I'm not necessarily sticking to them, but there are 5 key takeaways that I think I'd like to share. One is that missions is a new way of governing if the next government, whichever colour it is, decides to take it up. And it's a new way of governing that gives us an opportunity to move from crisis to renewal. And then hopefully it will address the challenges that the country faces by bringing together the skills, the talents and creativity that exists across government with the rest of UK society and our economy. And the North Star of the project, the North Star of the paper, is the mantra that we have to lead with purpose and govern in partnership. I think this is the thread that runs through everything in the 72 pages that we've got in the report. But it's the importance of ambition, of direction, and of a genuine, broad and inclusive approach to partnerships from central government to the rest of the UK, which we think has to be baked in to the programme of the next government after the 4th of July. 2, I think missions have to be the top priority for that government. This priority needs to be communicated and owned by the Prime Minister, by the Chancellor. If there is a new version of the Quad, those ministers as well have to live and breathe this as the animating dynamic for the government. And we have to make sure it's built into how government operates. I think leadership of missions needs to be held among the Prime Minister and their cabinet and the whole network of civil servants across local and regional government, across the private sector, civil society, and somehow we need to ensure that this reaches citizens and communities where they live as well. So actually it could be something, like I said, to animate that government. And then all of us need to be incentivised to direct our energy towards the missions that the country sets out for itself. 3, and this one's crucial, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Helen has to say about this. Not everything can or indeed should be done from Whitehall. I think to make a success of missions, government has to act differently. I think ministers need to learn how to orchestrate. They need to collaborate with and empower others to take these missions forward, to take them on board, to live them, to promote them, to breathe them. Civil servants need to develop, dare I say, a new mindset and a new set of sort of dynamic skills and capabilities that will help enable this change at the heart of government and actually ensure that we promote it across all tiers of government and the rest of the economy. I think together they need to galvanise and mobilise the private sector, civil society, local government, other arms of the state towards a set of shared goals. I think what government can do effectively is create the conditions for people to come together and give the rest of society the confidence to invest, to collaborate, and to find new ways of tackling the country's challenges. It's about direction and facilitation, not imposing things top down or micromanaging others. 4, missions are long term, which is going to be a wonderful thing to try and push through with the 24-hour news cycle, if nothing else. But we want to achieve things that are transformational. These things are not going to be accomplished on day one, in year one, even in term one. We need to start thinking this is a medium to very long-term way of thinking that we need to shift in the country. A new government will need to think long-term. That means stable, patient funding. It means that ensuring there is an appetite for innovation and experimentation along the way, and that there is that which might take time to come to fruition or scale up. We need to learn, we need to improve, we need to share knowledge in ways that we haven't been doing previously. And I think above all, mission-driven government needs to focus on its goals and needs to be resilient in the face of other pressures, because by golly, there are going to be huge pressures coming down the track in the second half of this year and for the next 4.5 years. And crucially, and this is my last major reflection, 5, central government needs to connect the missions to the day-to-day reality of people's lives. It can't be some abstract Gantt chart sort of deliverology sort of way of thinking potentially that worked 20 years ago. It's got to be something that we can communicate. I'm not doing it today necessarily, but communicate in words of 2 syllables or less and try to get people to understand what we're talking about. And again, to understand that there is a direction and a pace of travel. I think missions need to feel real. They need to feel authentic for the public. And we need to communicate that they are owned and iterated by the nation. It is not something that is owned by a bunch of elite individuals in SW1. It's got to be something that we flush through the system and take seriously. I think only if we do that, or rather, if we do that, then we can only if it does that, rather, can government nurture the authority and also the legitimacy it will need to act boldly and confidently on behalf of all of us. Now, there are a whole slew of actual recommendations. I'm not going to listen because I'll be very much out of breath. But definitely have a look at it. We can talk about it if you've had a chance to look at it online. The last thing I would want to say, though, like Mariana has said, thank you very much to Dan, to Nick, to Sarah Doyle. From our side, thank you very much to Grace Wild, to Bruno, Hamida, Sarah, and the rest of the team. And again, to Georgia, who, quite frankly, this is a legacy she's leaving, I think. It's an intellectual legacy she's leaving. As the leader of Camden, I think it's those of us who believe in it, it's something we can take forward and actually promote and hopefully work with her in Parliament should she get elected on the 4th of July.
Thank you so much. And then just before I go, yes, Mariana.
That's something
Yes.
I thought you were going to say. You didn't say it. Is it okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Could you, Mariana? Could you make Nathan's speech a bit better? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just in terms of the history and why we partnered together. For 2 years, just before COVID began, we partnered with Camden around this Camden Renewal Commission. So we printed this off for you all. I think there's a bunch of copies upstairs. And the idea was, how can a council actually, start implementing some of these ideas, but also learn from it? And that's, 2 of those examples I gave before on procurement and the wealth fund. But what was amazing about it was the commissioners were also across UCL. We had the head of UCLH at the time. We had people in Camden Council, but also people running Camden institutions. You might know the Camden Roundhouse, which has played a really important role in the creative sector. We had George the Poet, who then also became one of our PhD students. He's a Peabody award-winning podcaster. But just to read off what the 5 four Camden missions ended up becoming, because this actually led to the work. Because otherwise it just sounds like moonshots, or, we're working today with Brazil on their ecological transition strategy and so on. But the Camden work was so interesting because that's actually where we learned the devil's in the detail, all these issues around participation, also that Nathan mentioned. One was on borough-wide diversity in positions of power. So by 2030, those holding positions of power in Camden are as diverse as our community, and the next generation is ready to follow. We actually said, from our little humble IIPP academic position, what? That should be cross-cutting across all the missions. And Camden rightly said, no, it's going to be so hard to achieve that. Make it both a cross-cutting principle, but also its own mission. And by the way, we've heard that also in Barbados, where they've, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister, incredibly inspirational right now in the Bridgetown Initiative in Climate, said a lot of the principles of justice, of equity, of decolonizing our society has to be a mission itself, as well as a cross-cutting principle across the missions. Second, opportunities for young people. By 2025, every young person in Camden has access to economic opportunity that enables them to be safe and secure. So also in terms of the knife crime epidemic, what are the social and economic determinants of crime, so we don't just say more police, more prison, more safety and security as kind of ends in themselves, as opposed to what Michael Marmot, a UCL professor who was on the commission, has always talked about, the social and economic determinants of health and well-being. Third, access to food for all. By 2030, everyone eats well every day with nutritious, affordable, sustainable food. We worked with Sweden, for example, on their healthy food policy in schools. If school meals have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable, what does that mean for outcomes-oriented procurement? We brought those lessons to Camden, had discussions also with the Swedish folks. And then lastly, sustainable neighborhoods. By 2030, Camden's estates and their neighborhoods are healthy, sustainable, and unlock creativity. And in fact, the estates missions themselves, which Dan and others worked on, for example, with that outcomes-oriented adult social care in the estates, was one of the kind of submissions underneath that. So I just wanted to pay respect to Camden, which did incredible work, led by Nick and Georgia.
Thank you. And I want some people from Camden to talk a little later. Would be absolutely brilliant. But and we're going to come to Helen in a second. But Nathan, I'm going to ask you two quick questions after your initial comments.
Yeah.
One is, as a councillor, if you took power after a council of a different political persuasion, which had missions that you didn't think should be the missions, what would your response have been? And also, Keir Starmer has already spoken about a decade of, or a possible decade for a Labour government if they were to win, and presumably win pretty big, on July the 4th. If this is a democratic process, isn't the UK based around the notion that any parliament can undo what any government has done before as a essential principle of our democratic system in the UK? So how do you have long-termism when democracy is necessarily 5 years at most? So council first, government and parliament second.
Thanks. So on the first point, I think there are two things I would say. I mean, if you actually get to the nitty-gritty of what what local councillors and councils are doing, when you get to the grassroots and the sharp end, I think there is a lot of rhetoric. There's not a huge amount of differentiation in terms of the buckets of policy areas we're looking at, or indeed are allowed to look at. But also, if we're looking at some of the economic and social constraints that have scarred the local government sector since, I'll be non-partisan, since the crash in 2008. But obviously, we are looking at the trajectory of sort of central local government policy since 2010. It's been degraded and denuded. I honestly don't think there would be that much differentiation from one party to the next in terms of actually what it was trying to achieve in terms of environmental and waste policies, or trying to ensure that we're looking after those children that is part of our statutory duty. I mean, if we were to go back into sort of prehistory, right, and we were to think about issues like Barnet, pre-2010, when it was the EasyJet Council, and it was literally trying to get rid of everything, to charge its citizens for everything, and have a very slimmed down programme of core work, then I think that is something from an ideological point of view you might want to go in and shift. But in terms of actually, and bringing it back to the second part of the question, what we're actually tackling in the paper, because we're not actually taking task or providing a commentary on the substance of the Labour Party's missions, or indeed of the substance of the missions that Michael Gove set out in the Levelling Up White Paper. We're thinking about the how, the mechanics. Actually, how can we use this moment collectively as a country to use missions as a way of changing the system and the mechanics of government over time? So the reality, if it sticks, fingers crossed, there is meaningful sort of systems and collaborative change over the course of the first term. Obviously, there is nothing to stop the government going to election again in 2029 to go on a pitch of a different set of missions. And actually that then would be baked in, because you would be able to have that referendum or that discussion about actually how you want to take the policy and programmatic choices of a government forward. What we've really are deep diving into is giving much more thought about actually, quite frankly, how do we deconstruct and then reconstruct the way the British state works in terms of its ability to think, to deliver, to work in partnership, and then actually to open it up, to broaden it up, and actually, again, to go along with something that Keir Starmer has said. I haven't heard Rishi Sunak say it, but actually, it's putting some clothing on that coat hanger he's come out with about wanting to have a fundamentally new and different and more productive and positive set of relationships with the private sector, with the social sector, with citizens, and actually how can you bring people together, like I said, to galvanise them, because I think there's an issue here. Whatever happens, the inheritance for the next government is going to be the worst since at least 1974, if not since 1945. The way in which the last couple of budgets have been stacked, and some of the spending decisions and cliff edges that are coming at the back end of 24 into 25, it's going to be very, very difficult to have decent room for manoeuvre to tackle some of the really deep and systemic problems that have been allowed to build up in this country since the crash in 2008. So I think what we're arguing is actually it's a moment, like I said, to galvanise and mobilise people across sectors and across tiers of government to come together, to think, and then to work differently about tackling those big challenges that lie ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. Brilliant. Helen, can I bring you in? First, obviously, for initial reactions. I'd love as well, Helen, just a bit of background from inside government and Whitehall. You must be civil servants, must be relatively tired of people constantly giving civil servants advice on how to run things, which you actually do every day and are very expert in. Just give us a little thumbnail of what you've experienced inside government, I think would be wonderful, but also your response to this idea of mission-led government.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to get to your second part via my first answer, hopefully, but you can always call me up if I'm not. I wanted to start actually where Nathan ended his first part, which is just to say massive congratulations to everybody who's been involved in pulling this report together. I think it's genuinely inspiring. I appreciate we are probably in this room and on the stream a subset of a subset of a subset of people who are interested in the structures for government. But I think that the report is an astonishing achievement. And to nag you a bit, I would encourage you to read all 78 pages, because actually the kind of richness of what is there and the learning that's there and the distillation of some really smart stuff. So well done. And there's a big reason why I find it genuinely inspiring, again, notwithstanding the subset of the subset of the subset of people. And there are lots of people in this room who have heard me talk before who'll be surprised to hear me try and talk slowly and also have a piece of paper. But the reason I've done that is because I think that I want to make sure that I say all of the things that I want to say about this really important opportunity for change. And I thought I'd start with the things I like about a mission-led approach. And the first thing might sound bleeding obvious, but is so important, is that the mission-led approach starts off with the idea that there is a profound purpose to governing. And this might be new news, and it is absolutely emphatically not a criticism of ministers or different governments or anything. It is very hard, often on a day-to-day basis in government, to understand the point of the government that you are working for. What is the thing that I am doing today supposed to be achieving? It's very easy most of the time, not always, but most of the time it's very easy to work out what my minister wants, what my Secretary of State wants, even what this very clear direction has come from number 10. It's very, very unusual for most of the civil service to ever hear from the top of the shop. And the value of actually being able to listen to the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or the kind of lead thinker actually articulate the point of the government and what they're here for is just so extraordinary, and it's incredibly rare. And I think one of the things that a missions-led approach allows you to have is a kind of ideology and theory and explainable and detailed version of what is the point of what we're all trying to do. I'm not saying, by the way, that means all of government should be missions, but I do think that value should not be underestimated. And the second thing I really like about it is I think mission-led government, particularly the way that is articulated here, is honest. So it's honest about the kind of limits of what government can do, the limits about what any kind of set of humans in a room can do. It's really clear on that actually you only make change happen with lots of different people and by working in partnership, and also that some things you're going to get wrong. And I love that kind of brave honesty about saying we're going to reach for, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, but we'll reach for outcomes, but we'll be perfectly open to changing tack. Because one of the things that I think has been, is worse than it was when I joined the civil service in 2002, is the kind of inability to admit that you've got something wrong. And the difficulty for ministers to create the space to say, actually, I've changed my mind, and that not being jumped on as a sign of weakness. It is a sign of incredible strength to say, I was trying to achieve this big thing. 2 years into it, we've now worked out that this is a better way of doing it, so let's go. And anything that creates the space for those kind of conversations is going to be amazingly valuable. The third thing I like, and it's probably picking up slightly depressingly on your point about budgets, but actually I wouldn't... we have to be very realistic about how much is going to be possible to change in this next time period, because there isn't loads of money. But also, actually, even if there was loads of money, I wouldn't necessarily think that was the right answer, by the way. I think that you have to start thinking about what is the most efficient and productive way that you can use all of the time. Most of the resource of the state really is in the human beings and what they're doing all day. And can you try to, through this mission-led approach, make sure that most of the people, most of the time engaged by the government on work the taxpayer is paying for, are spending most of their time trying to do the thing the government was elected for. It sounds crazy when I say that isn't actually, and it's not through bad intent that doesn't happen, it's not very clear. So I think it's realistic about what it takes to make change happen, and I think it's about persuasion, not coercion, which, the person who taught me to be a civil servant was Tessa Jowell. And those of you in this room who came across her, she was an unbelievably persuasive person, but also she knew that the way to get things done was to be as generous as possible with the ideas and to create the broadest coalition you could to try to make them something different. I do believe, and I have been teased over the years about this, so after I left the civil service, I went to work in the Premier League, and I used to get laughed at for talking about total government, which will make sense to the small number of people in this room who know about total football. But there is a thing about if you want to do it, and I speak from my experience probably in the Cabinet Secretariat, which I ran from 2013 to 15, so the last stage of the coalition, that if you decide what you are trying to do is achieve a thing, and you are in the centre of government and you are able to actually pull together, yes, the procurement, yes, the policy, yes, the decision-making, yes, the spending, and have them all, broadly speaking, pointing in the right direction, you can make magic work on anything. And, my old boss, Jeremy Hayward, was a Jedi master about that. And you kind of have to do something which is turning that sort of ability into a system-wide thing, which is what I think missions really do. I'm trying not to talk about the Olympics today, but I might not be able to resist in the Q&A, just to warn you, so try and stay me off it. But the reason I am such a believer in total government is because I have seen it work, and that is the Olympics. If the Olympics had been terrible, by the way, we'd have spent so much more time talking about why it was awful. The fact it was such a resounding success, it still frustrates me to this day, as you can hear, the kind of relative incuriosity about what that was and what was the magic that, yes, delivered those fantastic 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 8 weeks as it was in the end, but also genuinely transformed that part of London, improved the schools, set another standard for construction safety. The list of things that kind of came out of that radiant project was huge, and it was delivered entirely by national government, local government, the mayor, public and private partnerships, the local community. You couldn't do it without that massive combined and collective effort. And it's very easy to say, oh, that was just the Olympics and it was different. For 7 years of the Olympics, it was just misery and everyone thought it was terrible, and then it turned out okay in the end. So, and you just have to go around the world and see what didn't happen in other cities and what didn't happen in other places. And that is like a shining testament to the best of government, and it stands with us today. And then two other things about why I like it is that government doesn't get to pick and choose. And so I have, it's great, and it's been really fun and good for me to be back part of conversations with people preparing for government, and the excitement is palpable and all of that is lovely. But there is a real danger, and I was really pleased to hear you say this, Nathan, about the kind of deliverology mindset. It's really easy to think that what you do when you get into government is you have a list of stuff, and you're going to do your list of stuff, and you're going to put your 30% of your best effort in the centre of Whitehall, and you're going to have the shiniest people and the most amount of prime ministerial attention. And in the end, what you've done is create a really small canvas, usually, and you've got a list of stuff that you can tick through. And I like that. I think the missions thing gives you something different. It gives you a framework in which, over time, what you can decide to do is do governing in a way which is going to deliver the things you wanted to deliver, rather than this kind of very narrow list. And to just make that come alive a bit, I think housing is probably my best example of why the kind of list-based approach to government, which we have been doing for decades, by the way, this is not is always makes it a problem that somebody else can solve in the future, and always makes it a problem that isn't quite on somebody's desk. And then here we are today, and if you wanted to fix one problem, what is the problem I imagine most of you in this room would fix? Is that everyone had somewhere safe and secure to live. And there is a real thing about that kind of, and it's very attractive, it's very easy, governing is hard. It's really boring. It's really hard if you want to make change happen. And it's much easier to pick an easy thing and run after it. So I like that about it too. And then the thing I've said already, but I'm just going to double down on, which is the adaptive mindset and the freedom to get things wrong, and the humility to think you're not the people who have the answer. And I think that, and I don't, I'm sure people who's more schooled than me on the theory of government would be able to explain why, but the lack of humility in government, and this isn't just from the ministers, by the way, I mean everybody who works in government and around government, that what really needs to change is the bravery to open up at the beginning of the process, not to consult at the end. Is like, why would you think, and actually Oliver Letwin was a brilliant disciplinarian on this, is why on earth would you think that somebody in SW1 has got the answer to this? Your starting position should be, they definitely don't. And then work backwards from that. Kamal, I promise I'm going to shut up in a minute, but I want to get to the bottom of my list, having said lists are bad. I do take the point about boundaries, and that missions need to have boundaries, and that you do have to have like a reason. If we're going to do all these things and you're going to achieve these really big change, you have to start somewhere. So saying to the whole of government, everything is now a mission. I've worked in enough government departments over time that actually you say these really big priorities, and then if you're somebody who's working on burials policy, you think, how am I supposed, and you just devalue a whole load of really important bits about the functioning of the state, and it's very easy to accidentally do that, and that shouldn't be done. I think, and in the report, there is a recommendation of a unit in the Cabinet Office, and I find it slightly heart-sapping to agree with any recommendation that the answer is a unit in the Cabinet Office. But I do think there is something about how do you get that central structure right. But it's so much more what Nathan was talking about your mindset and your culture. And are you sucking everything into the centre of Whitehall and deciding you have the answer and everybody else can get lost, including, by the way, line departments. It's never, I think some of the complaints that people make about not being involved in decision making apply just as much if you work in CLG as if you work in the local government, to be honest. But you've got to get into a different kind of mindset, that the job in the centre is to be facilitative and empowering and create the space and have the structures. And you absolutely have to join up the various bits of work and thinking, the most important of which is the Treasury spending. So this will never work as an approach if you have, this is the Prime Minister's priorities for missions and this is what we're doing, and here's all these mission boards, and then here's the Chief Secretary to Treasury with a different set of outcomes and a different set of things they want to do. My next point is about culture. So I think, again, if you want to really change the world, you have to really change some of the cultures of Whitehall and Westminster. And again, that's not a party political point. It's human beings are not always incentivised to do the right things when they get very, very close to power. And I would hope that a new Prime Minister would be really brave in holding to account his own special advisors and his own ministers, and calling out kind of non-collegiate and non-cooperative behaviour from early on. And I don't mean the kind of, necessarily the briefing and the bad stuff that happens above the surface, but the kind of corrosive approach of, if you have people being rivals and working in an unpleasant way together or trying to do one over on each other, and I'm not naive about how politics works, but I do think there's a thing about setting the tone from the top and then making sure that over time and over an administration, what you reward is you reward the people, and this is on beholden on the civil service as well, is you behold the people who have collaborated the most, who've been the most open. So the ministers who get promoted are those who have actually sometimes taken a hit for their own department because they've done the right thing for somebody else. And I think you have to kind of send those really strong signals into the system. There's a story I tell about when I got to EDS where this is the cabinet secretariat is usually, and it definitely was then, a very competitive environment with very, very brilliant civil servants. It's great. But I had these 5 teams and they all individually came to see me as the new boss, and they said, we operate like a barrister's chambers, really. We're very separate and we do things, we work together, but we have our own things. And this really annoyed me. So I said that they would, and they were very, very ambitious and very, very brilliant, and very, very brilliant in every sense. So I said, well, okay, well, just so you know, in terms of performance marking at the end of the year, it's the person who collaborates the most that is going to definitely be in box 1. And it was like that. I mean, they were clever and smart people, and they worked. But you have to do some things which are system and structural, and really, really, really hard incentivise the right sort of behaviours. I know, and I can sort of feel downstream the eye roll from my former colleagues about, okay, this is just another bit of joined-up government. Is joined-up government ever going to work, And all I would say, if I had the opportunity to speak to any of my former colleagues, is that it doesn't work now. I don't know anybody, and I mean ministers, civil servants, I don't know anybody who thinks that the way we've been governing our country structurally, and it's very much the how, not the what, that I'm talking about. I mean, maybe find a person, maybe that's a challenge for us all. We can go and find someone who thinks the way that we are set up works well for a 21st century economy that wants to be the kind of society that we are. It doesn't work well. And so actually, it's an extraordinary decision to take, to say the status quo works really well, let's just do a few tweaks around the edges and carry on as business as usual. Nothing is going to change. And there is now a moment where actually all of the things that could be done better. And so I think it's really important that however the conversation goes after the election, if it is a Prime Minister who wants to do mission-led government, there is a way in which the civil service itself can contribute to the question and the outcome about actually how to structure things better. It's one of the really funny things about how Whitehall works is everyone's very respectful, rightly, of each other. So at any one moment, there'll be possibly 10 people sitting in the Cabinet Office who are doing the advice on machinery of government or how to structure things or how things should operate. And it's kept very close hold to the Cabinet Secretary and very kind of, you do your best, right? I definitely did my best to talk to other people about it, but it's very, very close. And I think that if it was possible to listen to the wisdom of the decades and decades and decades of experience that you have within the civil service, because they don't go to work all day thinking I'd like to do a really rubbish job today. They go to work because they're public servants who want to do good and make a difference. And I think if there's any way of being able to listen to them collectively and get the benefit of their wisdom, they will, not to contradict, they don't always have the right answers. Nobody has the right answers, but I think that'd be really helpful. And then I will... do you want me to stop there? Because otherwise I'm talking for 400 hours.
And I think I remember covering the Olympics, obviously a decision made because of Tessa Jowell, the Olympics, and in the end, Tony Blair. Much closer, Mariana, the notion of let's deliver the Olympics for this date, much more like let's get to the moon, because you had a clear moment of delivery when something had to have happened by. But Helen, what's the difference between what happened with the UK and the Olympics and what happened with the UK and HS2?
That's a good one, but can I tell you a John F. Kennedy story first while I'm thinking about the answer? Which is, if you have, I'm sure you've all listened to that speech where he says, we will go to the moon by the end of the decade. And as a civil servant, my favourite thing is he then says, and do the other things. Which is like, it's a total, oh yeah, and that other stuff. We're going to the moon though. So they're different, right? So the Olympics was, once you bid for the Olympics, you're doing it. You can't decide not to do it anymore. You can't decide, I'm only going to do it in this week. You've got an external pressure, which is like, you have to do it. It has to be on these dates. It has to be these sports. It has to be whatever. So your freedom to move is really small. Whereas with HS2, it's a government programme and you can change government programmes as much as you like. I think a more useful way, perhaps, of thinking about the question is that we've got to think differently about how some kinds of government investment is done. And the capital programs is one of the really easy, obvious, low-hanging fruit of like in a sensible. You don't have to look very far from the UK to find countries which are better organised in terms of strategic investment on infrastructure, and that you would, I think, you create much more stronger boundaries around that kind of spending decision. There's lots of clever people who've thought of lots of different ways of doing that. The other thing that I would say about HS2 is that it's a really good example of a transport project which was about transport, not about other things like improving outcomes, proper outcomes for people and the economy and life. It's also something which was based on one of the many things I love about this report is there's quite a lot about changing the Green Book, which I'd love to change the Green Book, because one of the very, 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 very deep foundational value for money things on the Green Book to do with HS2 is to do with journey time and the notion that you get a productivity benefit by making journey time shorter because you don't work on the train, which tells you how long ago it was that was actually done. And that was hardwired into the VFM case for a really long time. And there is these kind of structural ways of thinking about how you're going to govern to deliver benefits for everybody. And you shouldn't be able to do massive capital projects without actually having to demonstrate how you are actually impacting on everything else other than building some shiny infrastructure. And that's the Olympics was shiny infrastructure with huge social and economic benefits and a really fun time in 2012.
Fantastic, thank you, Helen. We want to bring some more people in, but Mariana, just before we come to lots of the brilliant people in here, Mariana, tell us about some experiences. You travel the world speaking to governments, delivery organisations, businesses. What can we learn? Helen's touched on this, but what can we learn from other nations or other projects within other countries?
Sure. Can I just say something small about the Olympics in terms of how important it was also for us precisely in what you said? So transport, which you just mentioned, is a sector. And coming back to, this is about ambitious problems that require different sectors to collaborate and solve and do the homework problems, maybe fail along the way. That's actually what we ended up doing, and I see Sam Lister there in the back. So with Sam, he was heading up the challenge leads when Greg Clark was the Secretary of State, head of BAYS, and that was actually the first thing we did as an institute. We kind of came in to Greg and said, look, you've got this sector-based industrial strategy, automotive, aerospace, finance, creative industries, and life sciences, to do what? And by the way, there's lots of other sectors that just haven't lobbied their way up and told you that they're the top sectors. So on the back of that, they actually set up the so-called challenge-oriented industrial strategy, of which one of the challenges was the future of mobility. Turning that broad challenge into a mission was then what we did with the challenge leads, including Ted Hayden. And what was interesting about that was that then the mission they came up with, and this was done with the civil servants, it wasn't us coming in, as Martians into government telling them what the missions were. It was about having a congestion-free, accessible, sustainable mobility system. And just the fact that it had the word accessible meant that some of those bottom-up projects, by the way, the mission maps are up here. How useful. It's like Open University old style, just point to a poster. So, some of the projects underneath, these are the ones we did with the European Commission, but with the government, with that mission, it meant that you needed innovation in areas like disabilities. So coming back to your point of how do you make everyone feel valued, what missions do is they create, the sum is bigger than the parts. What you currently have in Europe, and here's some of the lessons of where it goes wrong. In Europe, we helped create this missions instrument. It's part of the Horizon program, which is in the DG for innovation. So it's not interministerial. It ended up going into a little silo of the Department of Innovation, like BAYS, let's say. It didn't go to the center of the Green Deal. But also what they've then done, because it's not at the center, at the kind of cabinet level, you now have this 2 trillion EU recovery fund. It's like the equivalent of their sort of IRA. And they've told all the member states that in order to access this recovery, they need to have a plan. They didn't use mission, just a plan around climate and digitalization. How easy is it just to come up with projects, right? So all these projects around climate and digitalization across Europe. So literally what you have today in Europe is the opposite. Just turn those posters around. It rains down projects on top of these poor ministers. There's no alignment. There's no mission statement. So then the instruments they have are not actually helping to create that alignment. So some of the examples of what that means, again, across the world where we worked, in the US, believe it or not, we actually helped to design the CHIPS Act, which is this close to $400 billion act to help the U.S. become sovereign around chips production, because they learned also during COVID, all the supply chains, they were over-reliant on chips made in Asia. This was their, concern. We said, well, make sure it's not just a handout machine. What does it mean to actually put missions that they had around both energy but also working conditions at the center of the design of that policy? So the conditionality for the semiconductor companies that are accessing this public contribution, they have to commit to reducing their carbon emissions, so the energy efficient supply chains. They are not allowed just to use share buybacks, this problem of extraction, the financialized economy I talked about before. So you can't just use share buybacks with government-funded stuff. It's kind of obvious, but they had to put it in. They have to pay workers a living wage and good working conditions, right? So that was an interesting example that we helped to inform with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, on what does it actually mean to not just talk about climate as your mission, but if you have these different priority areas, embed it in everything. So you don't have the usual silo where the cool stuff is done in the Department of Energy, and then your kind of science policies or your economic growth kind of modeling stays the same. The other thing in Brazil, perhaps the most interesting thing, is that their ecological transition strategies in the finance department. Because again, what usually happens is you have finance doing their usual thing, and then the interesting things are in either Department of Health, Department of Energy, where they're actually trying to solve big problems. So the big question there was, what does it mean for finance? What does it mean for outcomes-oriented budgeting? What does it mean for a redesign of their state investment banks? In Brazil, BNDES is one of the biggest national development banks in the world. So what does it mean to, again, create loans that are conditional through the State Investment Bank, which is governed by the Finance Department, conditional on the companies receiving those loans to move in that direction. In Europe, by the way, some countries have been doing this. I can't remember what I said before. Did I mention Germany? So Germany's public bank has, because they had the Energiewende mission, has over the last years provided loans conditional that companies, for example, in the steel sector, reduce the material content of production. In this country, we just gave big loans to the steel sector that's in trouble, condition-free. But also during COVID, it was interesting that this condition-free way that the public-private partnership works here was also revealed in how the subsidies were given to, say, companies like EasyJet. 600 million, condition-free. In France, where this idea of a kind of having a tenser public-private partnership, the support given to Renault and Air France was conditional on those companies committing to this carbon reduction. And I'll just finish by saying all this is important to come back to your point about budget. So I guess it'll be a bit funner if we disagree a bit. But this idea that there's a limited budget is, we could talk about MMT, which I won't, modern monetary theory. There's a whole debate about that globally of, where money comes from. Are there really limits? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you do this right, you expand productive capacity. You actually ultimately expand your budget. And it's easier said than done, but that point of having missions which create a catalytic multiplier and having conditionality at the center, because it's not just about partnership, we're all in it together, having conditions and grants, procurement, loans, subsidies, guarantees, bailouts during COVID that require investment by the business community. Not micromanaged, but clear direction. It's up to you, the how. In an investment-starved environment like the UK, but also that done well creates that dynamic, good public-private partnership. Ultimately, that expands your budget, right? So having that long-termism, it's not just the long-term mission, it's that growth ultimately is a result of this if you can do it right. So where we kind of get it wrong here, including, and I don't want to go too much into party politics, but saying that you have a 28 billion kind of green fund and then, oh no, we're going to show we're fiscally responsible, so it won't be 28 billion, it'll be less. Focusing on a number versus the design of the policy, improving that you kind of know what you're talking about in terms of that, will it have a multiplier effect or not? Is it just a handout machine, or is it going to create a much more dynamic investment machinery, if you want? I think that's where the budget issue comes in.
Helen, I love your point about let's change the culture. The culture's got to be different, cooperation. We have just been absolutely shocked by the infected blood inquiry findings, the malfeasance and misbehaviour of those in authority through that. Anyone who watched Paula Vennell's evidence on the Post Office inquiry, anyone who read the Hillsborough report, Stephen Lawrence, all manner of inquiries. I think there are over 100 inquiries going on at present into the way that not just public sector organisations, but organisations and partnerships do not work properly, I think is a real challenge for creating that narrative. The public trust since 2008-9 in the ability of institutions to deliver has really declined. And I think there is something about the realpolitik of the people we work with. But I just want to go to Nick, but yes, and then come back to you, Helen. Oh, yeah, go on. Yeah.
So I think that's, and I was hoping we'd get to talking about some of that today, because I think this is the thing to have in mind, anybody who thinks you can defend the status quo. And the consistent theme, I think, having read, I mean, I've only read about 2 or 3 chapters of The Infected. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of work. But I have read the Hillsborough, I've read a lot of public inquiry outcomes because, frankly, if you work in civil service, it's entirely what you ought to do and try and learn your own lessons as well as whatever institutionally is done. But it is absolutely awful how much of the underlying problem, and I'm sure we'll see this in the Post Office, I'm pretty sure we'll see it in the Grenfell inquiry, we're definitely going to see it in the COVID inquiry, which is that absolutely resolute defence of the status quo. That and the kind of how hard it is to be in a system like that, and how can you find the mechanism to be brave enough to say, hang on a second, this doesn't look right, and what happens to people who say, hang on a second, this doesn't look right, and the kind of unbelievable rigidity of the system in defence of itself. And I think that I hope, and I think it's a little bit odd that all of these things are always private, but I hope the civil service is asking itself some really big questions, having read the Infected Blood report, actually, because there are some really, really profound things about just the basics of the way the civil service works, which, taken cumulatively, caused massive, massive harm. And you've got to face into that. And a good way of facing into that is to change the way you work.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a gentleman over there, wasn't there? Yes. Yes.
Hi, it's Jake Sumner, and I've worked in government as special advisor before, in regional government and in local government. Know Nathan Frold and Marianne as well. That last point on consistency, I think, is a really important one, because, having worked in government as well, there's so much chop and change. There's different departments changing priorities and different funding pots and all this all over the shop. And as we've seen in the last few governments, I mean, I was in the Labour government, there's tons of ministers changing, which then changes all different processes. How, there's a fundamental reform of how we do the state in this country that's needed at regional and national level and more devolution. But how do we create the sort of consistency of approach that isn't chop and change and all the rest of it, to build that sort of long-term institutional change that's needed to deliver mission-orientated outcomes?
Fabulous, thank you. Mary, do you want to start? Or should we collect a few? There's a person there with a beard, and then there's a gentleman here with a white shirt, and someone here, just here as well. Yes, go. We'll do a few questions at a time.
Thank you. Hugh Lloyd. I was hearing my career being described as you were talking about things. I worked for Hazel Blair's and we sorted out the Olympics to some extent. I worked on High Speed 2 by accident when I worked for Hilary Benn. Then working with local government through austerity to create mandates for change for local authorities. I worked on 2 programmes that were part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. Kamal, I think you were at Hay over the weekend, probably recently. Yes. I was there. I don't know if you saw Michael Sandel. So Michael Sandel had a fantastic presentation, and the heart of what he described was the future of politics lies with humility. I searched the report when it came out. Lots of references to purpose, absolutely agree with that. I was looking for learning, because learning is actually what drives, we want to change, we want to improve, we want to make this better. There's quite a few references to learning, not as many as purpose. There is actually 2 references to humility. How do we engender humility in the senior civil service and ministers?
Brilliant. Person there? Thank you. Yeah, and then we'll come to the panel.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Richard Watts. I work for the Mayor of London. I used to be a council leader. One of the things that strikes me from reading a really very good and very interesting report is the level of change to the fundamental operational mindset of government it will take to deliver this, and the kind of tenets of new public management that have so dominated civil service thinking, procurement, KPIs, and the whole rigmarole around it. And given there's always a risk with an incoming government of new minister syndrome, of people being desperate to get their hand on the levers of power, and it takes them far too long to realise they're not connected to anything. And you need to look at this kind of stuff. How do we work collectively with a new incoming government, potentially? I need to keep my monitoring officer happy too, to to get the kind of get the understanding of the depth of the change to the way that government works in this country.
Yeah, brilliant. And then just a person just in front.
Thank you. My name's Caroline Abrahams. I'm the charity director at Age UK, but I've also worked in government and in politics. And as I've been listening to this, I've been thinking, is some of this a bit like what Tony Blair tried to do in '97 with initiatives like the Social Exclusion Unit, which was very much cross-sector and certainly much more so than we've seen in recent years? And then I thought, actually, the difference with this is this requires government to let go, and it also requires the Treasury to let go. And so I think my question is, do we think that's likely to happen? And if we do, is it because actually there's no money?
Brilliant, thank you. Mariana, start us off with sustainability. How do you sustain over time without all this chopping and changing as different elected, let's not forget their mandate, elected politicians come in, say, I have a mandate, that last lot who I've been attacking for the last 5 years or however long it might be are useless and we're going to do something different. How do you create sustainability? I thought, Nathan, your points earlier in the discussion were very interesting, that actually a lot of these things are much closer than we imagine, than the headlines may suggest. But Mariana, on that point.
Yeah, I mean, so ministers come and go, prime ministers come and go, the civil service remains. So, I mean, it comes back to also why we set up this institute 6 years ago. Those dynamic capabilities that you need within a public sector that sees itself as not de-risking, enabling, fixing markets, facilitating, the word I hate the most. Why? Because Kennedy said something else. He said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means you need to embrace uncertainty, learn along the way, learning by doing, trial and error and error and error, which they made. By the way, one of their biggest errors was in the Apollo 1, when those 3 astronauts died, burnt to death in the lunar module. One of them, before being burnt to death, Gus Grissom, said, how are we going to get to the moon when we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear what was being said in mission control room. What did NASA do in the back of that? They didn't say, oh, yeah, Kafkian bureaucracy, we're so inertial and slow. They said, we got to change our bureaucracy. They said, we need to make it agile, flexible, project managers, each with their delegated teams in constant communication one with another. Why did they do that? Because they had, again, a purpose and a mission. If government's just there fixing and tinkering, there's no reason to change their bureaucracy. There's no reason to change the status quo. There's no reason to have dynamic capabilities to co-create value, because you're just enabling someone else's value creation, and you end up with no confidence in the room. So a lot of this capture and corruption and sometimes even nepotism or whatever that happens, if we also look at the procurement scandals during COVID, happen not because you have other big government, or it happens precisely when you don't have strong metrics to hold government accountable. That's why we worked recently with the BBC on their notion of public value. What does that mean to hold an organization accountable around public value? And it's incredible that the BBC is one of the only public organizations that has even kind of bothered to do that. But that learning by doing, precisely when you're not allowed to learn, because as soon as you screw up, which you do, right, learning how to ride a bike, you got to fall off, you're then blamed, front page of the Daily Mail if you make a mistake. That kind of risk averseness is part of the reason why there's also been this massive outsourcing to consulting. Can you move back? Consulting companies. So like during COVID, paying, Deloitte 1.5 million a day to do test and trace. It wasn't because government didn't have capacity. We have GDS, Government Digital Services, is an incredibly dynamic digital capacity inside the UK government, which its own history is super interesting, because the part of the Olympic story that you didn't mention is they first brought in G4S to do security, completely screwed up, then bring in the military to do it. Well, the G4Ss and the Sercos that are asked to do things like create a government website, which Serco was asked to do, completely failed, charged the government a lot of money. It was actually the iPlayer team, sort of, that then through Mike Bracken, who's up above you, that poster, Tom Loosemore and others who then set up GDS, Government Digital Services, set up gov.uk in the Cabinet Office, won an International Design Award. But then we're kind of told, okay, you've done the website, now you can go home, as opposed to this means actually doing government differently. They were really disillusioned, right? But the capacity is there sometimes in government, but this fear of taking risks, because you will be blamed, whereas the venture capitalists can brag about all the risks risk they took. That's the huge cultural shift that we need to make. And that's why we've been working a lot globally, like in Chile with their Laboratorio de Gobierno. Sounds great. Everything sounds good in Spanish or Italian. But it's basically a gov lab that goes across government where they experiment and learn how to do some of these things we talk about in the report, like outcomes-oriented procurement instead of cost-plus, low-cost procurement.
Great. Nathan, can I bring you in on this question of humility? There is an interesting section, and I think, Helen, it touches on this ability to admit failure around this duty to serve. How are people who have power over people's lives humble in the way they exercise that power? But again, I just do want to bring maybe reality, maybe not reality, but maybe some history as well. That government, local government, national government are not good at doing that. I don't quite see in the report where you're going to get this mindset change that is so necessary, given the metronome of reports that you've touched on, Helen, on where this stuff doesn't work.
So I think a lot of the thinking that I know that Nick and the team at Camden have done about the concept of humble government comes actually from an organisation which sounds very similar to one that some chaps over there work for. There's an organisation called Demos Helsinki, and actually they've been pioneering this concept of humble government and actually really leaning into humility as part of the suite of the suite of ideas that we need to think about much more fundamentally in across the public sector. But the issue is, but you're right to actually challenge this back, because it doesn't really happen anywhere at scale. And that's one of the interesting things, actually, to be fair to Gove, but then also to Starmer over the last 4 or 5 years. If this takes roots in this country, it's going to be the first of those sort of major global north economies that are really sort of leaning into this as a new way of thinking it through. So it's very much going to be a work in progress. I mean, one of the other the other issues, it's sort of or 2 points really. It sort of hints at or speaks to. I'm also a refugee from the BBC, so I used to work at Millbank in the political unit back in the glory days of the Iraq War in 2003, 2005. And actually, if you start thinking then about how the whole relationship between that government and the media, full stop, changed pretty fundamentally over a very short period of time. And actually, Helen can maybe attest to this from being inside the machine. It's actually how some of the barricades have gone up. And then actually, over those last 20 years, I think we need to have a much more honest conversation with the media and with other stakeholders then about actually if we are on this panel thinking, yes, we need to do things differently, we need to be able to have the space and the creativity to think about actually how does the fourth estate, in its role holding elites to account, play that role as well. The only other main reflection I wanted to get in, which I forgot earlier basically, but it kind of is tangential to what you've asked me. There is a big issue going in, and it comes back to my point about actually, is this the biggest challenge since 74, 45, 1914, whatever? But the reality is, and as Helen has glanced upon it, the state is, if not broken, it's pretty much close to it. I think it might be in a better position now than it was 2 years ago, through a lot of hard work for people still being in the system. And it's going to be fantastically difficult. The inheritance for whether it's the continuation of a new Sunak administration or if it is Labour coming in after 14 years of being out, this is a big challenge to shift government, to do it differently, to take a two-term approach to actually fundamentally transform it. But at the same time, they're going to have to make the system, if it is Labour going in, they're going to have to make the system they inherit work today and tomorrow and next year, because Wes Streeting is going to have to bring down waiting lists. Bridget Phillipson is going to have to ensure that educational attainment continues to go up. Rachel is going to have to work out how we pay for public services. So we're going to have to actually start one plate spinning on day one if they come in, make the current system work better to ensure that we can have some decent outcomes in the short term, and then on day two think, oh Christ, I've got to start splitting a second plate now, because whilst thinking about the day job today, tomorrow, next week, we've got to be thinking year 5, year 10, how do we transform the country and leave it in a much better place and in a much better state than when they go in, if they win.
Thank you, Nathan. Helen, operational mindset. In the end, the Treasury is not going to agree to any of this. Thank you very much. We're going to control things, by the way, because everyone else is useless. How do we change that approach?
So I'm going to defend my former Treasury colleagues in a second, but I'm going to try and answer some of the points that were just raised as well. And I think the point I'd make on your private sector thing is that we need to get away from government being something that's done to you, to something that governing is something that belongs to all of us that we do together. I mean, I am also, conversation the other day, there's a real concern about what's happening to our democracy. Like, it's nice, doesn't feel like it's very present in the middle of a really rapacious election campaign. It's loads of fun, but there is a real challenge facing lots of countries, all of us, whatever. But what is actually happening to our democracy? And that's another thing. Not to load everything in the world onto missions-led approach, but I think there is something about how can you have more honesty between the state and between citizens, and how can you make some of these things a shared thing. I think the question about ministerial change is a really interesting one. And actually it's really important, and I spent a lot of time in Whitehall doing this, is that when you get a new minister, and I'm not talking about change of government, I'm talking about a new Secretary of State, which, happens various times, you do have to do what they want, and what they want might not be the same as what the last guy wants. And you have to be able to keep that flexibility and adaptation, and nobody should be scared of that. That's absolutely fine. That's actually how it works. However, if we get a kind of missions-led approach, some sort of programme for government, some sort of really long list. The programme for government that the coalition had, by the way, was extremely helpful because it was a really, really long list of these are all the things we are trying to achieve, and it was a helpful reference point. So I think you can somehow, through some really, really simple mechanisms of having more stuff written down, and a discipline that makes you change the thing that you wrote down and thought was a good idea last year, is this still right? Has it changed? And have something that day to day departments and ministers can live by. Create a framework, write it down. Some of this is really simple, and I'm going to go full kind of administration and bureaucracy, because the point on the Treasury isn't about budgets and investment and economy. The point is, don't have another controlling mind. That's all it is. It's absolutely fine. The Treasury needs to do what the Treasury needs to do. And we've all seen in recent years what really happens when the Treasury is not allowed to do what it really should be able to do. And it's not that the people in the Treasury go to work every day and think, fantastic, how can I really do over that department? They often have a different metric, right? They are trying to work out how the best short-term, and short-term is critical here, short-term value can be returned to the taxpayer from every pound that they spend. And some of the fundamentals, which is why the thinking that is really important here, we haven't talked today about machinery of government change and how you move the deck chairs around in Whitehall, and I'm so pleased about that, because what instead we're talking about is the wiring of how the state operates. And it's the wiring of how the state operates, which is hardly talked about, not public, not exposed, doesn't change very much. And then we're surprised that actually things aren't working so well, because actually the wiring is ancient, and the wiring is actually the person who sat down and thought, actually, how do you do a spending round? I mean, that person's probably not alive anymore, right? So, take the opportunity in any world to think about what is going to be different and better, because I would just like to say again, I do not think this is a party political thing. I think you will find, and I have heard ministers of every single party I've worked for make exactly the same point. And maybe it's time to actually make some changes to the how, and changes to the how might well make the what better. But actually, why haven't we asked any of those questions? Why are we still working in the same system? Is the way our civil service is structured the right thing for it? These are really important questions that it seems really odd that we don't have more of a public debate about. And I think this sort of framework should help us to do. And the kind of, how do you know if it's working? So I think the biggest risk with missions is that everyone goes, yay, missions. And I've had so many conversations with civil servants still in the system. They're like, oh, it's brilliant because we've redesigned our whole government, our whole departmental policies around missions. So everything, I'm pretty sure every new Secretary of State briefing will have lots of stuff about the missions in it. And that is not to be as mean to my former colleagues as I sound, but it's what you do, right? What you do if you're the civil service is you try to hug as close to possible to any crumb that's been given to you about what a new government might want to do, because you want to please them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is something, the default is lots of chat about missions, some exotic structure in the Cabinet Office, a new unit, and then basically most of government just carries on like normal. And I hope that doesn't happen. It's my very, very non-ambitious way of thinking about it, because actually there is an opportunity to do things really differently. And we will all know, I mean, some of you will be there and might know for that reason, but you can't have a mission-led approach to government and Whitehall the size that it is now. That's not the right, there's no way in which that's the right answer. You can't have some of the structures of governance, all sorts of things. It can't all be in London. Decision-making can't all be in London. You don't need that many people working in Whitehall. You need to think about where is the most efficient and energetic place you can create the broadest community and coalition to deliver change. And that is not going to be messing about in Whitehall.
Mariana, Nathan, Helen. It's at least 38 degrees in here, but we've managed to keep cool. What a brilliant audience. For the people here, sadly not watching from around the world, there is a drinks reception. Let's have a quick look what that is. I think it may be literally upstairs in the ground floor seminar room. You can go and read the full reports, whether you're in this room or watching from around the world, on the FGF and IIPP websites. Do look on Twitter and on LinkedIn and do share far and wide and keep an eye out for this conversation. Next time, Mariana, let's get a few businesses in here as well. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and goodbye.